Week 7, Overview, Reshaping Europe and South America. Over the next 3 weeks, students will explore South America as Simón Bolívar leads new nations to independence in the aftermath of Napoleon's downfall. In the meantime, the crowned heads of Europe will gather at the Congress of Vienna to rearrange Europe after Napoleon's exile. There's a lot of reorientation going on this week, so let's get started. With the defeat of Napoleon, Europeans began picking up the pieces of normal life. Medieval Europe was no more. Napoleon had leveled much of it as he brought it into his new empire. A great and glorious Congress convened in Vienna, Austria, to redraw the political boundaries. It wasn't easy to do. The common people of Europe were restless and eager for more freedoms, based on the new revolutionary doctrines of liberalism and nationalism, yet the old dynasties were still zealous to maintain their former power. The Congress met for months, forging settlements that helped avoid any major European conflict for the next 100 years. Europe wasn't the only place in transition, however. The New World was undergoing changes too. We're going to study the history and geography of South America in depth for the next 3 weeks. If you haven't already made plans for an end-of-the-unit celebration, how about planning a trip to the zoo? You can honor your wife for all her hard work this unit. If you have a decent zoo nearby, just pack a picnic for the afternoon. If you're a long way from a zoo, you may need to reenact the Lewis and Clark expedition. Either way, a trip to the zoo is a perfect way for the whole family to wrap up a study of South America. So, let's dive into the history of South America. Tapestry students explored South America when the conquistadors overran it back in year 2. After Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492, explorers from Spain and Portugal encountered civilizations like the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in the Andes. The Aztecs were great warriors who enslaved the people they captured or sacrificed them to their insatiable idols. The Incas were skilled in engineering, politics, and craft works. Their empire stretched more than 2,500 miles along the Pacific coast of South America. The Spanish and the Portuguese enslaved native peoples, ruling them with an iron fist. Though many actions of the European masters were evil, Roman Catholic missionaries traveled with the conquistadors, and these often carried the good news of Christ to the suffering natives of these lands. Year after year, the native peoples of South America and imported black slaves toiled in mines and on farms and sugar plantations for Spanish taskmasters, exporting gold, silver, and raw materials. People from these distinct cultures intermarried, creating new blended cultures. European overlords didn't allow these colonies to develop any local industries, infrastructure, or even newspapers, unlike colonial America. Spain and Portugal ruled South America with an iron fist until France took over Spain, or tried to. Napoleon could not bring Spain into full submission, and his inability to enforce his will on the colonies encouraged the patriots of South American countries to dare to dream and work for independence for their homelands. When Napoleon attacked Spain and Portugal in the Peninsular War, the South American colonies saw an opportunity to win independence. A champion rose up to meet the challenge. His name was Simón Bolívar, and he has been called the George Washington of South America. Over the next 3 weeks, we'll be discussing Bolívar's life in detail. This week, let's talk about his early life and influence, as well as his first unsuccessful attempt at revolution. Bolívar was born in Venezuela in 1783 to members of the Spanish nobility. He lost his parents by the time he turned 15 and was sent to Spain to finish his education. He toured the continent and was very impressed with Napoleon, the first consul of France. Back in Madrid, he fell in love, married, and brought his new bride back to Venezuela, where she died a few months later. Bolívar was devastated and vowed never to marry again. To distract himself, Bolívar toured Europe again. He was shocked at what he found. Napoleon had crowned himself emperor by now, which disgusted Bolívar. He swore never to let personal power corrupt him, as it did Napoleon. In Rome, he made a vow that he would dedicate his life to working for South American independence. In 1807, Bolívar returned to Venezuela. The next year, 1808, Napoleon made his brother king of Spain. The South American colonists refused to obey anybody but the true Spanish king. Young Bolívar joined a resistance movement. In 1810, Bolívar went to England in search of support for a war of independence. While there, he helped to persuade an old Venezuelan war hero, Francisco Miranda, to lead the Revolutionary Army. Miranda had fought in both the American and French revolutions. They returned to South America, where Miranda, Bolívar, and others declared Venezuela to be an independent republic. This first revolt was a failure. Natural disasters frightened the superstitious revolutionaries. During Easter week, 2 severe earthquakes decimated the Venezuelan forces. The first swallowed whole houses and seemed to hit hardest in places where resistance was the strongest. The Royalists played on the superstition of the people and circulated the idea that heaven itself opposed the already unpopular resistance to the Lord's anointed, Fernando VII. The second earthquake lasted for 8 hours and destroyed the courage of all but the most committed patriots. The Venezuelan leader, Miranda, may have been a war hero, but he was also incompetent. The Spanish exploited his mistakes and overcame the patriot forces. Miranda capitulated, and the insurrection was crushed. Bolivar retreated to what is now Colombia, where the Congress of New Granada gave him a military command. In 1813, he launched what he called the Admirable Campaign. Now, from any earthly perspective, Bolivar was an incredibly talented general. This first campaign in 1813 was remarkable. He fought against terrific odds, starting with only 500 men. Within 90 days he had fought 6 pitched battles, traveled 1,200 kilometers, destroyed 5 hostile armies, captured 50 pieces of artillery and 3 ammunition depots, and reconquered all the western parts of Venezuela. The Spaniards used force and terror to defeat the supporters of the revolutionaries. They committed atrocities against civilians in an attempt to demoralize the patriots and their friends. Bolivar retaliated by declaring a war to the death, in which any Spaniard caught by a patriot would be killed without mercy. On August 6, 1813, Bolivar took Caracas and proclaimed the Second Venezuelan Republic. It lasted a little longer than the first, but not much. Bolivar was driven into exile for years by the Spanish, but he came back. We'll continue following Bolivar's career in the weeks to come. While Bolivar fought for freedom in South America, a Congress of diplomats met in Vienna, Austria, from 1814 to 1815 to reestablish the political boundaries after Napoleon. The major players were the victorious Austria, Great Britain, Prussia, and Russia, and, oddly enough, the defeated France. The Congress had several goals. First, the delegates were eager to ensure that the enemy would never rise again. They created buffer countries along the French border to keep France from gaining too much power. Delegates also needed to figure out what to do with the new countries that Napoleon had created, like the German Confederation, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and the Kingdom of Italy. The Congress solved these problems by redrawing boundaries, creating new countries, restoring old monarchies, always keeping an eye to the balance of power in Europe. The Congress hosted hundreds of delegates and their staffs, but the decisions were made in closed meetings by the 5 major powers. If you're part of a co-op, you may get a chance to reenact the Congress of Vienna. We've crafted a simulation for a group of older kids that lets them role-play the various major powers of Europe, either individually or in teams, while parents and siblings can play minor dignitaries and their staffs. The Congress of Vienna set the tone for a major continent for an entire century. It took months for 1,000 dancing diplomats to put Europe together again, and even as they did so, Simón Bolívar was turning South America upside down. The years we're studying this week shaped the world we live in today.